Welcome to Stories with Liz and to another ghost story, this time by Perceval Landon and his short story called Thurnley Abbey. It was first released in 1908. 3 years ago, I was on my way out to the east, and as an extra day in London was of some importance, I took the Friday evening mail train to Brindisi instead of the usual Thursday morning Marseilles express. Many people shrank from the long 48-hour train journey through Europe and the subsequent rush across the Mediterranean on the 19-knot Isis or Osiris, but there is really rather little discomfort on either the train or the mailboat, and unless there is actually nothing for me to do, I always like to save the extra day and a half in London before I say goodbye to her for one of my longer tramps. This time, it was early, I remember, in the shipping season, probably about the beginning of September. There were few passengers, and I had a compartment in the P&O Indian Express for myself all the way from Calais. All Sunday I watched the blue waves dimpling the Adriatic and the pale rosemary along the cuttings. The journey was just like any other. We ate in the dining cart as often and as long as we decently could. We slept after luncheon. We dwelled the afternoon away with yellow-backed novels. Sometimes we exchanged platitudes in the smoking room, and it was here that I met Alistair Clavin. Clavin was a man of middle height, with a resolute, well-cut jaw. His hair was turning grey, his moustache was sun-whitened. Otherwise, he was clean-shaven, obviously a gentleman, and obviously also a preoccupied man. He had no great wit. When spoken to, he made the usual remarks in the right way, and I dare say he refrained from banalities only because he spoke less than the rest of us. Most of the time he buried himself in the Wagonlit Company's timetable, but seemed unable to concentrate his attention on any on the page of it. He found that I had been over the Siberian Railway, and for a quarter of an hour he discussed it with me. Then he lost interest in it and rose to go to his compartment, but he came back again very soon and seemed glad to pick up the conversation again. Of course, this did not seem to me to be of any importance. Most travelers by train become a trifle infirm of purpose after 60 hours of rattling. But Clavin's restless way I noticed in somewhat marked contrast with the man's personal importance and dignity. Especially ill-suited was it to his finely made large hand with strong, broad, regular nails and its few lines. As I looked at his hands, I noticed a deep and recent scar of ragged shape. However, it is absurd to pretend that I thought anything was unusual. I went off at 5 o'clock on Sunday afternoon to sleep the hour or two that had still to be got through before we arrived at Brindisi. Once there, we few passengers transhipped our hand baggage, vertified our berths, and were only a score of us in all, and then after an aimless ramble of half an hour in Brindisi, we turned to dinner at the Hotel International, not wholly surprised that the town had been the death of Virgil. I remember rightly, there is a gaily painted hall at the International. I do not wish to advertise anything, but there is no other place in Brindisi at which to await the coming of the mails. And after dinner I was looking at the trellis overgrown with blue vines when Clavis moved across the room to my table. He picked up El Secolo, but almost immediately gave up the pretense of reading it. He turned squarely to me and said, "Would you do me a favor?" One doesn't do favors to stray acquaintances on continental expresses without knowing something more of them than I knew of Clavin, but I smiled in a non-committal way and asked him what he wanted. I wasn't wrong in part of my estimate of him. He said bluntly, "Will you let me sleep in your cabin on the Osiris?" And he colored a little as he said it. Now, there is nothing more tiresome than having to put up with a stable companion at sea and I asked him rather pointedly, "Surely there's room for us all?" I thought that perhaps he had been partnered off with some mangy Levantine and wanted to escape from him at all hazards. Clavin, still somewhat confused, said, "Yes, I am in a cabin by myself, but you would do me the greatest favor if you would allow me to share yours." This was very well, but besides the fact that I always sleep better when alone, there had been some recent thefts on board English liners, and I hesitated, frank and honest and self-conscious as Clavin was. Just then the mail train came in with a clatter and a rush of escaping steam, and I asked him to see me again about it on the boat when we started. He answered me courtly. I suppose he saw the mistrust in my manner. "I am a member of the Whites." I smiled to myself as he said it, but I remembered in a moment that the man, if he were really what he claimed to be, and I make no doubt that he was, must have been sorely put to it before urging the fact as a guarantee for his respectability to a total stranger at a Brindisi hotel. That evening, as we cleared the red and green harbor lights of Brindisi, Clavin explained, "This is his story in his own words. When I was traveling in India some years ago, I made the acquaintance of a youngish man in the woods and forests. We camped out together for a week, and I found him a pleasant companion. John Burton was a light-hearted soul when off duty, but a steady and capable man in any of the small emergencies that continually arise in that department. He was liked and trusted by the natives, and though a trifle overpleased with himself when he escaped into civilization at Sima or Calcutta, Burton's future was well assured in government service when a fair-sized estate was unexpectedly left to him, and he joyfully shook off the dust of the Indian plains from his feet and returned to England. For 5 years he drifted about London. I saw him now and then. We dined together about every 18 months, and I could trace pretty exactly the gradual sickening of Burton with a merely idle life. He then set out on a couple of long voyages, returned as restless as before, and at last told me that he had decided to marry and settle down at his place, Thurnley Abbey, which had been long empty. He spoke about looking after the property and standing for its constituency in the usual way. Vivian Wilde, his fiancée, had, I suppose, begun to take him in hand. She was a pretty girl, with a great deal of fair hair and rather an exclusive manner, deeply religious in a narrow school. She was still kindly and high-spirited, and I thought that Burton was in luck. He was quite happy and full of information about his future. Among other things, I asked him about Thurnley Abbey. He confessed that he hardly knew the place. The last tenant, a man called Clark, had lived in one wing for 15 years and seen no one. He had been a miser and a hermit. It was the rarest thing for a light to be seen in the abbey after dark. Only the barest necessities of life were ordered, and the tenant himself received them at the side door. His only half-caste manservant, after a month's stay in the house, had abruptly left without warning and had returned to the southern states. One thing Burton explained bitterly about. Clark had wilfully spread the rumor among the villagers that the abbey was haunted, and had even condescended to play childish tricks with spirit lamps and salt in order to scare trespassers away at night. He had been detected in the act of this tomfoolery, but the story spread, and no one, said Burton, would venture near the house except in broad daylight. The hauntedness of Thurnley Abbey was now, he said with a grin, a part of the gospel of the countryside, but he and his young wife was going to change all that. Would I propose myself any time I liked? I, of course, said that I would, and equally, of course, intended to do nothing of the sort without a definite invitation. The house was put through repairs, though not a stick of the old furniture and tapestry was removed. floors and ceilings were relaid, the roofs was made watertight again, and the dust of half a century was scoured out. He showed me some photographs of the place. It was called an abbey, though as a matter of fact it had been only the infirmary of the long-vanished Abbey of Gloucester some 5 miles away. The larger part of the building remained as it had been in its pre-Reformation days, but a wing had been added in Jacobean times, and that part of the house had been kept in something like repair by Mr. Clark. He had in both the ground and the first floor set a heavy timbered door strongly barred with iron in the passage between the earlier and the Jacobean parts of the house, and had entirely neglected the former, so there was a good deal of work to be done. Burton, whom I saw in London 2 or 3 times about this period, made a deal of fun over the positive refusal of the workmen to remain after sundown. Even after the electric light had been put into every room, nothing would induce them to remain, though, as Burton observed, electric light was death on ghosts. The legend of the Abbey's ghost had gone far and wide, and the men would not take the risk. They went home in batches of 5 and 6, and even during the daylight hours there were an inordinate amount of talking between one another, if either happened to be out of sight of his companion. On the whole, though nothing of any sort or kind had been conjured up by their hated imaginations during their 5 months' work upon the Abbey, the belief in the ghost was rather strengthened than otherwise internally, because of the men's confessed nervousness, and local tradition declared itself in favor of the ghost of an immured nun. "Good old nun," said Burton. I asked him whether in general he believed in the possibility of ghosts, and rather to my surprise, he didn't say that he entirely disbelieved in them. A man in India had told him one morning in camp that he believed that his mother was dead in England, as her vision had come to his tent the night before. He had not been alarmed, but had said nothing, and the figure vanished again. As a matter of fact, the next possible dakwala brought on a telegram announcing his mother's death. There the thing was, said Burton. But at Thurnley he was practical enough. He roundly cursed the idiotic selfishness of Clark, whose silly antics had caused the inconvenience. At the same time, he couldn't refuse to sympathize to some extent with the ignorant workman. "My own idea," he said, "is that if a ghost ever does come in one's way, one ought to speak to it." I agreed. Little as I knew of ghosts' world and its conventions, I had always remembered that a spook was in honor bound to wait to be spoken to. It didn't seem much to do, and I felt that the sound of one's own voice would at any rate reassure oneself as to one's wakefulness. But there are few ghosts outside Europe, few, that is, that a white man can see, and I had never been troubled with any. However, as I said, I told Burton that I agreed. So the wedding took place, and I went to it with a tall hat which I bought for the occasion, and the new Mrs. Burton smiled very nicely at me afterwards. As it had to happen, I took the Orient Express that morning, and was not in England for nearly 6 months. Just before I came back, I got a letter from Burton. He asked if I could see him in London, or come to Thurnley, as he thought I should be better able to help him than anyone else he knew. His wife sent a nice message to me at the end, so I was reassured about at least one thing. I wrote from Budapest that I would come and see him at Thurnley 2 days after my arrival in London, and as I sauntered out of Pannonia into the Kirepsi Utsa to post my letter, I wonder of what earthly service I could be to Burnham. I had been out with him after Tiger on foot, and I could imagine few men better able at a pinch to manage their own business. However, I had nothing to do. So after dealing with some small accumulation of business during my absence, I packed a kit bag and departed for Euston. I was met by Burton's great limousine at Thurnley Road Station, and after a drive of nearly 7 miles, we echoed through the sleepy streets of Thurnley village, into which the main gates of the park thrust themselves splendid with pillars and spread eagles and tomcats rampant on top of them. I never was a herald, but I know that the Burtons have the right to supporters, heaven knows why. From the great gates a quadruple avenue of beech trees led inwards for a quarter of a mile. Beneath them a neat strip of fine turf edged the road and ran back into the position of the dead beech leaves, killed it under the trees. There were many wheel tracks on the road, and a comfortable little pony trap-jogged past me laden with a country person and his wife and daughter. Evidently there was some garden party going on at the Abbey. The road dropped away to the right at the end of the avenue, and I could see the Abbey across a wild pasturage and a broad lawn tightly dotted with guests. The end of the building was plain. It must have been almost mercilessly austere when it was first built, but time had crumpled the edges and torn the stone down to an orange-lynched gray wherever it showed behind its curtain of magnolia, jasmine, and ivy. Farther on was the 3-story Jacobean house, tall and handsome. There had not been the slightest attempt to adapt the one to the other, but the kindly ivy had glossed over the touching point. There was a tall flèche in the middle of the building, surmounting a small bell tower. Behind the house there rose a mountainous verdure of Spanish chestnuts all the way up the hill. Burton had seen me come from afar and walked across from his other guests to welcome me before turning me over to the butler's care. This man was sandy-haired and rather inclined to be talkative. He could, however, answer hardly any question about the house. He had, he said, only been there 3 weeks. Mindful of what Burton had told me, I made no inquiries about ghosts, though the room into which I was shown might have justified anything. It was a very large, low room with oak beams projecting from the white ceiling. Every inch of the walls, including the doors, were covered with tapestry, and a remarkably fine Italian 4-post bedstead, heavily draped, added to the darkness and dignity of the place. All the furniture was old, well made and dark. Underfoot there was plain green pile carpet, the only new thing about the room except the electric light fittings and the jugs and bins. Even the looking-glass on the dressing table was an old pyramidal imitation glass set in heavy repose frame of tarnished silver. After a few minutes cleaning up, I went downstairs and out upon the lawn, where I greeted my hosts. The people gathered there were the usual country type, all anxious to be pleased and roundly curious to the new master of the Abbey. Rather to my surprise and quite to my pleasure, I rediscovered Glenham, who I had known well in old days in Broadisland. He lived quite close, as he remarked with a grim, "I ought to have known." "But," he added, "I don't live in a place like this." He swept his hand along low lines of the Abbey in obvious admiration, and then, to my intense interest, muttered beneath his breath, "Thank God." He saw that I had overheard him and turned to me and said decidedly, "Yes, thank God, and I meant it. I wouldn't live at the Abbey for all the Burtons' money." "But surely," I demurred, "you know that old Clark was discovered in the very act of setting light to his bugaboos." Graham shrugged his shoulders. "Yes, I know that. But there is something wrong with the place still. All I can say is that Burton is a different man since he has lived here. I don't believe he will remain for much longer." "But you're staying here. Well, you'll hear all about it tonight. There's a big dinner, I understand." The conversation turned off to old reminiscences, and Glenham soon after had to go. Before I went to dress that evening, I had 20 minutes' talk with Burton in his library. There was no doubt that the man was altered, gravely altered. He was nervous and fidgety, and I found him looking at me only when my eye was off of him. I naturally asked him what he wanted of me. I told him I would do anything I could, but that I couldn't conceive what he lacked that I could provide. He said with a lustrous smile that there was, however, something that he would tell me the following morning. It struck me that he was somehow ashamed of himself, and perhaps ashamed of the part he was asking me to play. However, I dismissed the subject from my mind and went up to dress in my palatial room. As I shut the door, a draught blew out the Queen of Sheba from the wall, and I noticed that the tapestries were not fastened to the wall at the bottom. I have always held very practical views about spooks, and that it has often seemed to me that the slow wavering in firelight of loose tapestry upon a wall could account for 99% of all the stories one heard. Certainly, the dignified undulation of this lady with her attendants and huntsmen, one of whom was untidily cutting the throat of a fallow deer upon the very steps of the King Solomon's, a grave-faced Flemish nobleman with the Order of Golden Fleece awaited his fair visitor, gave color to my hypothesis. Nothing much happened at dinner. The people were very much like those of the garden party. A young woman next to me seemed anxious to know what was being read in London, and she was far more familiar than I with the most recent magazines and literary supplements. I found salvation in being myself introduced in the tendencies of modern fiction. The true art, she said, was shut through and through with melancholy. How vulgar were the attempts at wit that marked so many modern books! From the beginning of literature, it had always been tragedy that embodied the highest attainment of every age. To call such works morbid merely begged the question. No thoughtful man, she looked sternly at me through the steel rims of her glasses, could fail to agree with me. Of course, as one would, I immediately and properly said that I slept with Pet Ridge and Jacobs under my pillow at night, and that if Jorrocks weren't quite so large and corny, I would add him to the company. She hadn't read any of them, so I was saved, for a time. But I remember grimly that she said that the dearest wish of her life was to be in some awful and soul-freezing situation of horror. And I remember that she dealt hardly with the hero of Nat Painter's vampire story between nibbles at her brown-bright eyes. She was a cheerless soul, and I couldn't help thinking that if there were many such in the neighborhood, it was not surprising that old Glenham had been stuffed with some nonsense or other about the Abbey. Yet nothing could well have been less creepy than the glitter of silver and glass and subdued lights and crackle of conversation all around the dinner table. After the ladies were gone, I found myself talking to the rural dean. He was a thin, earnest man who at once turned the conversation to old Clark's buffooneries. But, he said, Mr. Burton had introduced such a new and cheerful spirit not only to the Abbey, but he might say into the whole neighborhood, that he had great hopes that the ignorant superstitions of the past were from henceforth destined to oblivion. Thereupon his other neighbor, a portly gentleman of independent means and position, audibly remarked, "Amen," which damped the rural dean, and we talked of partridges past, partridges present, and peasants to come. At the other end of the table, Burton sat with a couple of his friends, red-faced hunting men. Once I noticed they were discussing me, but I paid no attention to it at the time. I remembered it a few hours later. By 11, all the guests were gone, and Burton, his wife, and I were alone together under the fine plaster ceiling of the Jacobean drawing-room. Mrs. Burton talked about one or two of the neighbors, and then, with a smile, said she knew I would excuse her, shook hands with me, and went off to bed. I am not very good at analyzing things, but I felt that she talked a little uncomfortably and with a suspicion of effort, smiled rather conventionally, and was obviously glad to go. These things seemed trifling enough to repeat, but I had throughout the faint feeling that everything was not quite square. Under the circumstances, this was enough to set me wondering what on earth the service could be that I was to render, wondering also whether the whole business was not some ill-advised jest in order to make me come from London for a mere shooting party. Burton said little after she had gone, but he was evidently laboring to bring the conversation round to the so-called haunting of the Abbey. As soon as I saw this, of course I asked him directly about it. He then seemed at once to lose interest in the matter. There was no doubt about it. Burton was somehow a changed man, and to my mind he was in no way changed for the better. Mrs. Burton seemed no sufficient cause. He was clearly very fond of her, and she of him. I reminded him that he was going to tell me what I could do for him in the morning, pleaded my journey, lighted a candle, and went upstairs with him. At the end of the passage leading into the old house, he grinned weakly and said, "Mind, if you see a ghost, do talk to it. You said you would." He stood irresolutely a moment and then turned away. At the door of his dressing room he paused once more. "I am here," he called out, "if you should want anything. Good night," and he shut his door. I went along the passage to my room, undressed, switched on the lamp beside my bed, read a few pages of the Jungle Book, and then, more than ready for sleep, turned the light off and went fast asleep. 3 hours later I woke up. There was not a breath of wind outside. There was not even a flicker of light from the fireplace. As I lay there, an ash tinkled slightly as it cooled, but there was hardly a gleam of the dullest red in the grate. An owl cried among the silent Spanish chestnuts on the slope outside. I idly reviewed the events of the day, hoping that I should fall off to sleep again before I reached dinner, but at the end I seemed wakeful as ever. There was no help for it. I must read my Jungle Book again till I feel ready to go off, so I fumbled for the pear at the end of the cord that hung down inside the bed, and I switched on the bedside lamp. The sudden glory dazzled me for a moment. I felt under my pillow for my book with half-shut eyes. Then, growing used to the light, I happened to look down to the foot of my bed. I can never tell you what really happened then. Nothing I could ever confess in the most object words could even faintly picture to you what I felt. I know that my heart stopped dead and my throat shut automatically. In one instinctive movement, I crouched back up against the headboard of the bed, staring at the horror. The movement set my heart going again, and the sweat dripped from every pore. I am not a particularly religious man, but I had always believed that God would never allow any supernatural appearances to present itself to man in such a guise and in such circumstances that harm, either bodily or mental, could result to him. I can only tell you, at that moment, both my life and my reason rocked unsteadily at their seats. The other Osiris passengers had gone to sleep. Only he and I remained leaning over the starboard railing, which rattled uneasily now and then under the fierce vibration of the over-engined mailboat. Far over there were the lightings of a few fishing smacks riding out the night, and a great rush of a white combing and seething water fell out and away from us overside. At last Calvin went on. Leaning over the foot of my bed, looking at me, was a figure swathed in a rotten and tattered veiling. This shroud passed over the head, but left both eyes and the right side of the face bare. It then followed the line of the arm down to where the hand grasped the bed end. The face was not entirely that of a skull, though the eyes and the flesh of the face was totally gone. There was thin, dry skin drawn tightly over the features, and there was some skin left on the hand. One whip of hair crossed the forehead. It was perfectly still. I looked at it, and it looked at me, and my brains turned dry and hot in my head. I had still got the pair of electric lamp in my hand, and I played idly with it, only I dared not turn the light out again. I shut my eyes, only to open them in a hideous terror the same second. The thing had not moved. My heart was thumping, and the sweat cooled me as I evaporated. Another cinder tinkled in the grate, and the panel creaked in the walls. My reason failed me. For 20 minutes or 20 seconds, I was able to think of nothing else but the awful figure still there, till there came, hurling through the empty channels of my senses, the remembrance that Burton and his friends had discussed me fruitily at dinner. The dim possibility of its being a hoax stole gratefully into my unhappy mind, and once there, one's pluck came creeping back along the thousand tiny veins. My first sensation was one of blind, unreasoning thankfulness that my brain was going to start the trial. I am not a timid man, but the best of us need some human handle to steady him in time of extremity, and in this faint but growing hope that after all it might only be a brutal hoax, I found the fulcrum that I needed, and at last I moved. How I managed to do it I cannot tell you, but with one spring towards the foot of the bed, I got within arm's length and struck one fearful blow with my fist at the thing. It crumbled under it, and my hand was cut to the bone. With a sickening revolution after my terror, I dropped half faintingly across the end of the bed. So it was merely a foul trick after all. No doubt the trick had been played many times before. No doubt Burton and his friend had some large bet among themselves as to what I would do when I discovered the gruesome thing. From my state of abject terror, I found myself transported into an insatiate anger. I shouted curses upon Burton. I dived rather than climbed over the bed end on the sofa. I tore at the rope skeleton. How well the whole thing had been carried out, I thought. I broke the skull against the floor and stamped on its dry bones. I flung the head away under the bed and rent the brittle bones of the trunk into pieces. I snapped the thin thigh bones across my knee and flung them in different directions. The shin bones I set up against a stool and broke with my heel. I raged like a berserker against the loathly thing and stripped the ribs from the backbone and slung the breastbone against the cupboards. My fury increased as the work of destruction went on. I tore the frail rotten veil into 20 pieces, and the dust went up over everything, over the clean blotting paper and the silver inkstand. At last my work was done. There was but a raffle of broken bones, strips of parchments, and crumbling wool. Then, picking up a piece of the skull, it was its cheek and temple bone of the right side, I remember. I opened the door and went down the passage to Burton's dressing room. I remember still how my sweat-dripping pajamas clung to me as I walked. At the door I kicked and entered. Burton was in bed. He had already turned the light on and seemed shrunken and horrified. For a moment he could hardly pull himself together. Then I spoke. I don't know what I said. Only I know that from a heart full and overfull with hatred and contempt, spurred on by the shame of my own recent cowardice, I let my tongue run on. He answered nothing. I was amazed of my own fluency. My hair still clung lankly to my wet temples. My hand was bleeding profusely, and I must have looked a strange sight. Burton huddled himself up at the head of the bed just as I had. Still he made no answer, no defense. He seemed preoccupied with something besides my reproaches, and once or twice moistened his lips with his tongue. But he could say nothing, though he moved his hand now and then, just as a baby who cannot speak moves his hands. At last the door into Mrs. Burton's room opened, and she came in, white and terrified. "What is it? Oh, what is it? Oh, in the name of God, what is it?" She cried again and again, and then she went up to her husband and sat on the bed in her nightdress, and the two faced me. I told her what the matter was. I spared her husband not a word for her presence. Yet he seemed hardly to understand. I told the pair that I had spoiled their cowardly joke for them. Burton looked up. "I have smashed the foul thing into 100 pieces," I said. Burton licked his lip again, and his mouth worked. "By God," I shouted, "it would serve you right if I thrashed you within an inch of your life. I will take care that not a decent man or woman of my acquaintance ever speaks to you again. And there," I added, throwing the broken piece and the skull upon the floor beside the bed, "there is a souvenir for you of your damned work tonight." Burton saw the bone, and in a moment it was his turn to frighten me. He squealed like a hare caught in a trap. He screamed and screamed till Mrs. Burton, almost bewildered as myself, held on to him and coaxed him like a child to be quiet. But Burton, as he moved, I thought that 10 minutes ago I perhaps looked as terribly ill as he did, thrust from him and scrambled out of the bed upon the floor, and still screaming, put his hand onto the bone. It had blood on it from my hand. He paid no attention to me whatsoever. In truth, I said nothing. This was a new turn indeed to the horrors of the evening. He rose from the floor with the bone in his hand and stood silent. He seemed to be listening. Time, perhaps," he muttered, and almost at the same moment fell at full length on the carpet, cutting his head against the fender. The bone flew from his hand and came to rest near the door. I picked Burton up, haggard and broken, with blood over his face. He whispered hoarsely and quietly, "Listen, listen." We listened. After 10 seconds of utter quiet, I seemed to hear something. I could not be sure, but at last there was no doubt. There was a quiet sound as of someone moving along the passage. Little regular steps came towards us over the hard oak flooring. Burton moved to where his wife sat, white and speechless, on the bed, and pressed her face into his shoulder. Then, the last thing that I could see as he turned the light out, he fell forward with his own head pressed into the pillow of the bed. Something in their company, something in their cowardice helped me, and I faced the open doorway of the room, which was outlined fairly clearly against the dimly lighted passage. I put out one hand and touched Mrs. Burton's shoulder in the darkness, but at the last moment I too failed. I sank on my knees and put my face into the bed. Only we all heard. The footsteps came to the door, and there they stopped. The piece of bone was lying a yard inside the door. There was a rustle of moving stuff, and the thing was in the room. Mrs. Burton was silent. I could hear Burton's voice praying, muffled in the pillow. I was cursing my own cowardice. Then the steps moved out again on the oak boards of the passage, and I heard the sound dying away. In a flash of remorse, I went to the door and looked out. At the end of the corridor, I thought I saw something that moved away. A moment later, the passage was empty. I stood with my forehead against the jambs of the door, almost physically sick. "You can turn the lights on," I said, and there was an answering flare. There was no bone at my feet. Mrs. Burton had fainted. Burton was almost useless, and it took me 10 minutes to bring her to. Burton only said one thing worth remembering. For the most part, he went on muttering prayers, but I was glad afterwards to recollect that he said that thing. He said it in a colorless voice, half as a question, half as a reproach. "You didn't speak to her." We spent the remainder of the night together. Mrs. Burton actually fell off into a kind of sleep before dawn, but she suffered so horribly in her dreams that I shook her into consciousness again. Never was dawn so long in coming. 3 or 4 times Burton spoke to himself. Mrs. Burton would then just tighten her hold on his arms, but she could say nothing. As for me, I can honestly say that I grew worse as the hours passed and the light strengthened. The 2 violent reactions had battered down my steadiness of view, and I felt that the foundation of my life had been built upon sand. I said nothing, and after binding up my hand with a towel, I did not move. It was better so. They helped me, and I helped them, and we all 3 knew that her reason had gone very near to ruin that night. At last, when the light came in pretty strongly and the birds outside were chattering and singing, we felt that we must do something, but we never moved. You might have thought that we should particularly dislike being found as we were by the servants, yet nothing of that kind mattered a straw. An overpowering listlessness bound us as we sat, until Chapman, Burton's man, actually knocked and opened the door. None of us moved. Burton, speaking hardly and stiffly, said, "Chapman, you can come back in 5 minutes." Chapman was a discreet man, but it would have made no difference to us if he had carried his news to the room at once. We looked at each other, and I said that I must go back. I meant to wait outside till Chapman returned. I simply dared not re-enter my room alone. Burton roused himself and said that he would come with me. Mrs. Burton agreed to remain in her own room for 5 minutes if the blinds were drawn up and all the doors left open. So Burton and I, leaning stiffly on against each other, went down to my room. By the morning light that filtered past the blinds, we could see our way, and I released the blinds. There was nothing wrong with the room from ends to ends, except smears of my own blood on the end of the bed, on the sofa, and the carpet, where I had torn the thing to pieces. Clavin had finished his story. There was nothing to say. 7 bells studded out from the forecastle, and the answering cry wailed through the darkness. I took him downstairs. Of course, I am much better now, but it is a kindness of you to let me sleep in your cabin. The end. Hope to see you next time for a different type of story. Bye for now.